So in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the details of the mammalian heart, and I'm going to be utilizing the human heart in most of my examples, but for the most part, that should translate to other mammals as well. All right, so let's talk about what the purpose is of the heart. We know that it's an extremely muscular organ. We're going to take a look at some of those components in a bit. And its job is essentially to pump blood to the lungs and also around the body. And so, this is just an outer view of the heart. And you can see right away that there are lots of different components to it, lots of, blood vessels coming to and from the heart. It's going to be important for you to know that blood on the right side of the heart is deoxygenated, which means it's lacking oxygen. And whereas blood on the left side of the heart is going to be oxygenated. Now, let's talk about left versus right before we move any further, because it can be a point of confusion for students. Now, I want you to remember that, in this image, it's as though we're looking at another person. But really what we need to be thinking about in terms of left and right is if this were my own heart in my body, which side would be the left and which would be the right? Well, if you think about your own heart, really we're looking at a mirror image here, right? So what appears to be on the left side of the image is actually what we consider to be the right side of the heart. So on the right side of the heart, we see all this deoxygenated blood. And on the left side of the heart, we see all the oxygenated blood. So if you have any questions about that, about directionality, feel free to drop into my Zoom meeting and we can discuss that a little bit further. But for now, we're going to look at the structures of the human heart. Now, I want to separate the structures themselves from the direction of blood flow. So we're not really in this segment of the video talking about blood directional flow. We're just going to be talking about the structures. So if it's helpful to you, in our week plan, I have linked in an unlabeled diagram. I believe it's this exact diagram, which you may want to pause the video and print in order to have sort of beside you. And I think that's a good brain exercise to connect what you're seeing and then actually physically with your hand writing in those labels. So if you're able to do that, I feel like that would benefit you. So I want to talk about the chambers of the heart first. We're going to start with this upper left-hand side part, which again we're going to remember is actually the right side of the heart. And it's called an atrium, the right atrium. You'll remember from our first unit that the mammalian heart will have 4 chambers. So we have one chamber here, another one here, and another one up here. So the atria are both on top and the ventricles are both on the bottom. So as you would expect, this would be labeled our right ventricle. Here would be our left atrium. And then, of course, our left ventricle. Okay, so the atria again on top and the ventricles on the bottom. Now, just as a side note, I want you to notice the thick muscularity that you see in this heart cross section, and particularly in the left ventricle. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Next, I want to talk to you about the valves, the heart valves, and there are 4 of them that we're going to be considering. And together they're called the atrioventricular valves, which I think makes sense given that we're looking at the valves between and through the atria and the ventricles. So first we have over here the valve that basically allows blood to move from the right atrium into the right ventricle. That is called the tricuspid valve. And on the other side of the heart, we have what's sometimes referred to as the bicuspid valve, but most often I'm seeing these days referred to as the mitral valve. 2 others that we need to talk about, and one of them is easy to see, it's here, and the other one over here is a little bit harder to see, so I'm going to point to it. And those are both what we call semi-lunar valves. So semi meaning half, and lunar meaning moon, so half moon. And you'll notice there's sort of like a half moon leaflet here and another half moon leaflet here. And so that's why we call them semi-lunar. And so this one right here is called the pulmonary semilunar valve, sometimes just called the pulmonary valve. And then this one over here is called the aortic semilunar valve. Okay, and you're going to understand why one's called the pulmonary and one's called the aortic in a little bit. Okay, so we've talked about the 4 chambers, we've talked about the 4 valves. Let's talk about blood vessels leading to and away from the heart. So up here we have the superior vena cava. So superior means above. And so down here, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see sort of the shadow here that the right atrium, the superior vena cava leads to the right atrium, but then also there's another vessel below that leads to the right atrium, and that is called the inferior vena cava. And like I said, both of them are going to be leading to that right atrium. Okay, so some other blood vessels that we see here, we see the aorta, and that's a big one. So the aorta, you can see contains oxygenated blood just through the coloration here, and throughout the video, we're going to remember that blue in the diagrams means the blood is deoxygenated, and red means that the blood, those blood cells are oxygenated. Okay, so we've got a couple of other blood vessels to talk about. We've got these pulmonary veins here. These are the ones on the left, but you know, they kind of travel behind, and it's hard to see, but you know, if you were to kind of put your fingers in the left atrium, you'd find holes that were the left pulmonary veins, and also kind of in behind here and behind, and coming out right over here are our right pulmonary veins. And by the way, in class, normally we do a sheep or a pig heart dissection, and we'd be able to sort of use our fingers to feel through all of the different flow patterns of blood. Okay, so veins, what else do we have? Oh yes, so now I want you to talk about this right here, this blood vessel, and it kind of goes through the aorta and in behind the superior vena cava. So this blue little section here is actually not connected to the superior vena cava at all. It's kind of like if this were a trunk, and by the way, sometimes it's called the pulmonary trunk. It branches into 2 branches, and one of them goes kind of through the aorta and behind the superior vena cava. Those are the left and then the right pulmonary arteries. So there we have the main structures of the heart. There's one more that I want to talk to that has less to do with blood flow, but is just structurally there, and that's the septum. Oops, I'm going to pause this so I can increase the size of my screen. There we go, that's better. So the septum, you can see, is this sort of thick muscular wall that is separating the 2 halves of the heart. And we're going to talk at the very end of this video how that makes for an efficient oxygen exchange situation for our blood. All right, so yeah, so the septum right there separating the right side and the left side of the heart. Okay, moving on. So now we're going to talk about blood flow into the heart. So this is a different kind of a diagram. It's the same diagram, but I'm going to go through the sequence of where the blood is moving as it enters from the body into the heart, all the way to where it is exiting the heart and going back into the body. So the blood from the upper part of your body, the part of the body above the heart, is going to enter through the superior vena cava. And any blood that is deoxygenated and needs to be reoxygenated, but it's coming from the lower parts of your body, are going to come in through the inferior vena cava. And they're going to enter into the right atrium here. And once they go into the right atrium, there's going to be a contraction of the right atrium, which is going to push the blood through the tricuspid valve and then into the right ventricle. Okay, so boom, boom, boom. Here we are so far. At that point, you know, the ventricles are going to contract or squeeze together, and that's going to push the blood out through this pulmonary semilunar valve and out through the pulmonary arteries. Okay, so you're going to see blood leaving through the left pulmonary artery and also the right pulmonary artery. And remember, artery means away from. Okay, people will often say arteries contain deoxygenate or oxygenated or deoxygenated and vice versa for the veins, but really it's not about oxygenation or deoxygenation. It has to do with the direction of travel relative to the heart. So arteries away from the heart, here we have the left pulmonary and the right pulmonary artery. My question is to you, why do we have two of them? Well, we have two lungs. So we need to have one pulmonary artery leading to the left lung and a different one leading to the right lung. And you'll remember from yesterday's video that, why does blood need to travel to the lungs? Well, that is where it's getting reoxygenated. So our blood's going to leave, it's going to travel to the lung, get all reoxygenated, by passing through that capillary network by the alveoli, right, and exchanging gas. Once it's all reoxygenated, then it's going to need a point of re-entry into the heart. And so that's where we're going to see the blood re-enter from the left lung and via the left pulmonary veins. Remember, veins, vien, meaning towards the heart. So into the left atrium, and the right pulmonary veins are going to move the blood into the left atrium as well, right? And again, we can't really see it, but there's kind of like these little tubey things. These veins actually lead into the right atrium, the left atrium, but we just can't see it because it's being blocked by this pulmonary trunk here. All right, so blood is now nicely oxygenated into the left atrium. The contraction of the left atrium is going to push that blood through the mitral valve and into the left ventricle. Now, the left ventricle, you'll notice, is much more muscular than the right ventricle. You'll have to remember that the blood leaving the left ventricle, has to move to all sorts of parts of the body, right? And it's leaving through the aorta, through the aortic semilunar valve, but getting through the aorta. And remember that our arteries, right, away from the heart, don't have those valves like our veins do. So the pressure needs to be pretty high. So our ventricle, specifically our left ventricle, is going to be supramuscular because it's pushing our blood out to the rest of our body. So let me just recap that. Oops. There we go. So left ventricle, squeezes together, contracts, pushes blood through that aortic semilunar valve, into the aorta, and then to the rest of the body, right? So through the top, the aorta, you need to know we can't see it in this diagram, but imagine just all the way behind and behind is another kind of lower, I guess, tube from the aorta leading out to the body. So this is connected to this. We just can't see it because it's in behind what we're seeing here. Okay, but both are going to pump blood to the rest of the body. So there we have it. We're going to go through more of this, so don't worry about it. We're going to keep reinforcing these ideas. If you find that the notes are more helpful, then that's fine as well. Feel free to stop and refer to that. So here's another couple of images that I think will be helpful just to reinforce. So here are the nice arrows. So, boom, boom. Okay, superior and inferior vena cava into our right atrium and ventricle, out to the lungs, back from the lungs, in through our left atrium, left ventricle, and then boom, out the aorta to the rest of the body. Now, a couple things I want to mention here. If I'm talking about the blood flow as though it's like a singular molecule moving through, but you need to know that the right and left atria are contracting at the same time, and the left and right ventricles are contracting at the same time and just pushing different volumes of blood to different places. So that's all sort of happening simultaneously. And the expansion of our ventricles is also helping to draw in blood from the atria as well. Okay, and here I maybe should have warned you about this, but here's a nice GIF that's, I don't even think this is a real heart. I think this is some kind of bionic animation. Not 100% sure. But here you can sort of see it looking more like what our heart would look like, and beating. Now, a few things I want to mention to you. We're going to talk more about the valves later, but here you can see our tricuspid valve, our mitral valve, our pulmonary semilunar valve. Our aortic semilunar is kind of hidden under there, so we can't really see it. Yeah. All right, so this next part of the video, and I should have warned you that this video might be a little bit long, and so you need to do this at your own pace. I'm going to go over the different terms and their structure and function, but if it works for you to simply jot these down or read them over from the Google Slides notes, then feel free to do that as well. But if you prefer the pace and the explanations along with the note, then stay with us. And so I'm just going to go through the table. The table is actually longer than this. It should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times 2, so 10 lines aside from just the title, the headers. So 10 terms that I'm going to talk about. And the first is pericardium. Now the pericardium, it wasn't really in any of the videos, but typically when we get our hearts in for dissection, we have to sort of remove the pericardium from around the heart. Peri means around, right? Think perimeter, and cardium meaning heart, right? So that's exactly what the pericardium is. It's this membrane that just is around the heart, and its job is to protect the heart within the body's cavity. So next we have the atria. So the atria is plural for atrium. We have 2 of them. Their job are going to be receiving blood from different parts of the body, right? So, you know, either receiving it from the body itself, which is our right atrium, or the lungs, which is the left atrium, and then eventually pump it to the ventricles. Next, we have the ventricles. The ventricles, of course, are going to be pumping our blood, but we discussed how they have these thick muscular walls, which are going to move the blood forcefully out of the heart. All right, so next we have the septum, and the septum, you'll remember, is that thick muscular wall that's going to separate the left side and the right side of the heart. We're going to talk about why that matters, and when we do a comparative anatomy study looking at animals from different kingdoms. Animals from different classes. So next we have the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve basically its job is to make sure that blood is not backflowing once it reaches the right ventricle back into the right atrium. I think that makes sense. The mitral valve is going to have a similar function. It's going to ensure that one-way blood flow, except that we're talking about the left-hand side of the heart. Our pulmonary artery away, so pulmonary meaning lung. So this is the blood vessel that's going to carry blood from the right ventricle into the lungs. Pulmonary semilunar valve is that valve that's going to make sure, again, that there's one-way blood flow from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery. All of our valves are essentially preventing backflow because that, of course, reduces efficiency. And some of you may look at that. That is one of the options for the circulatory system diseases. Well, what happens if our valves don't work properly? Pulmonary vein meaning towards the heart, and so it's going to be that's the blood vessel responsible for carrying blood from the lungs back to the heart and into the left atrium. Finally, we have the aortic semilunar valve. And so the aortic semilunar valve is the valve that's going to make sure that blood flow is going to travel from the pulmonary vein into the left atrium with no backflow. So lots of words there. I think probably for some of you this table may not have been necessary, but for those of you that need that extra sort of consolidation piece, there it is. Okay, so next what I want to talk about is the valves, and I've been hinting at this for a bit. I'm going to show you a diagram, and I'm going to give you points of reference that you know what you're looking at. So imagine that we took our heart diagram, and here we're looking at the heart from sort of the back compared to what we've looked at it previously. So here we have superior and inferior vena cava. So just imagine you're looking from the back instead of from the front as we have been. Here's the aorta. Here we can see, here's our arteries, our left and right pulmonary arteries, and here's our left and right pulmonary veins. And now you can see the whole thing because we're looking at it from the back. But then if you take a cross section of that and you look sort of from the top down, what you can see are the 4 atrioventricular valves. So here we have, I'm going to look at this, here's our tricuspid, and notice the tricuspid in this diagram is on the right-hand side of the diagram because we're looking at the heart from behind. I want you to notice that it has 3 little spots here, and then the mitral valve has 2, which is why it's, the tricuspid is called the tri, 1, 2, 3 cuspid, and the mitral is sometimes called the bicuspid, 1, 2, bi. Okay, let's look at these semilunar valves. We have the aortic and the pulmonary. I'm not really so much focused on where they are as much as just their structure. You can see that these valves are closed at the moment, and these little leaflets, 1, 2, 3 leaflets, are sort of coming together to close it off. I want to show you this in an animation just to kind of make it a little bit more vivid. So here we go. So again, pretty sure this is some kind of bionic thingamajig, but it shows you the same. You can sort of hear the points of reference, right? Our pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves, and you can see the leaflets kind of in action there. And then our bicuspid or mitral, and then our tricuspid valve. And you can see the sort of the 3 parts coming together here if you look closely with that tricuspid valve, and the 2 pieces with our bicuspid. Now, I want to look at those, the tricuspid and bicuspid or mitral valve a little bit. They have these little cords here. They're called chordae tendineae, and they just kind of connect to the inner part of the ventricle on each side, and that helps to control the opening and closing of those valves. But our semilunar valves, this animation next is this is actually, I think, just constructed in a lab, but it still sort of shows you how those leaflets work together to open and close as blood is pushed through. So the blood in this case, the blood would be coming kind of like towards us. And you can see how the leaflets kind of come together to prevent that backflow. Pretty cool. Next, I want to talk about blood vessels in the heart. We've talked about blood moving around the heart, or sorry, through the heart, but not, the heart's a muscle, and muscles need blood and oxygen and in order to function, right, to produce energy to beat. So the movement of the blood around the heart itself is called coronary circulation. So coronary arteries are what we're going to be looking at. So if you look closely at this, what you're going to see is here we have a set of coronary arteries, and then over here we have another set of coronary arteries. I'm going to let that play again just so you can see it. Right, there we go. And then over here. Now, looking at a diagram here, we can see that, this is not blood coming from the body, getting reoxygenated, and then going back out. This is blood these arteries are providing blood to the heart itself, right? So we can think about them, you might think of them as coming towards the heart, but they're actually moving away because it's the blood that would have moved away from the heart, like through the heart in a way, that would have traveled to these arteries themselves. So we're not going to talk much more about that this year because it's beyond the scope of the course, but that may come up in one of your anatomy or physiology courses moving forward if you pursue this stream of study. Okay, so now what I want to do is go through an exercise with you to see if you can, without looking at your notes, remember the parts of the structures and the sequence of structures as blood flows from the body to the heart. So let's see how you do. So we're going to start with blood from the body that is deoxygenated. Where is it going? In other words, what do we call this structure? I'm hoping you can kind of guess before I highlight it. So, blood's coming from the body into the heart via the superior and inferior vena cava. Where is it traveling then? Oh, it's going to the right atrium. And then from the right atrium, it's going to pass through this valve. What do we call that valve? It's the tricuspid valve. Next, where is it landing? Where's that blood landing? It's landing in the right ventricle. Then the contraction of the right ventricle is going to push that blood right through this valve. What do we call it? The pulmonary semilunar valve. And then so through the pulmonary semilunar valve, we can see in this diagram nicely that pulmonary trunk branches off. And we're going to see blood moving to the pulmonary arteries. Where do they land after that? In the lungs. Good. So blood's moving to the lungs. It needs to get oxygenated at the lungs, and it needs to come back to the heart via the pulmonary veins into number 8, the left atrium, then to the left, oops, I forgot, the mitral valve, through the mitral valve, otherwise known as the bicuspid valve, to the left ventricle, up through this, what is that called? The aortic semilunar valve, or simply aortic valve, and then boom, out the aorta, eventually to the rest of the body. Just remember that there's also a lower component of that aorta. Okay, so there it is. Now, another exercise you might want to do is to try the same thing without a diagram. So I'm going to lead you through this. Let's see if you can come up with it. Normally in class, I'd just be getting you all to say it out loud, but we can't do that. So here we are. So try it, put your diagram away. See if from memory you can remember the sequence of events and just sort of mentally remember that image of the heart. We're going to start with deoxygenated blood from the body. Where is it traveling next? It's traveling to the superior and inferior vena cava. Where is it going next? To the right atrium. From the right atrium, it needs to pass through the tricuspid valve. After the tricuspid valve, where is it going to go? The right ventricle. The right ventricle is going to contract, and that's going to push blood from the right ventricle through the pulmonary semilunar valve. From the pulmonary semilunar valve, where is it going next? The pulmonary arteries. Those arteries are going to move that blood away from the heart. Where is it moving it to? To the lungs. Good. And the point of that is for that deoxygenated blood to become reoxygenated. The pulmonary veins are where they're going to have their re-entry point into the heart. And so the pulmonary veins are going to lead to where? The left atrium. The left atrium is going to contract. That's going to draw blood through the mitral valve and into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, that blood needs to be forcefully pushed to the body because it's now oxygenated. So it's going to travel first through the aortic semilunar, to the aorta, and finally to the body. So I'd love to know how you did with that. Just send me a note or pop in on Zoom and let me know how you're doing with this. Maybe we can set up another kind of conference or something at some point soon. A couple other points I want to talk about. First of all, I want to mention that your textbook has this lovely diagram there, so feel free to check that out. I liked it because it I didn't want to do this all at once all together because there are a lot of layers here, but now that we've talked about it, I feel like you might appreciate having all of these pieces together. So it's talking about not only the structures, but also the blood flow with the arrows, which is super helpful. So feel free to use that and as a resource. Okay, now I'm noticing that my diagram isn't quite fitting in the whole screen here, so I'm going to pause. Okay, now we can get a bit of a better look here. So what I wanted to do was because this course we're talking about not just mammals, but we've talked about amphibians, we've talked about reptiles. So I thought it would be good to sort of just compare and contrast some of what we've already talked about before and just bring it more to life given what we've just learned about the mammalian heart. So amphibians, you'll remember we talked about as having a 3-chambered heart. So they essentially have 1 ventricle and 2 atria. And so here on the right-hand side, the right atrium would be bringing deoxygenated blood from the frogs or from the amphibian's body back to the heart, where it gets drawn into a ventricle, right? And that ventricle, when it contracts, is going to push blood to the lungs to get reoxygenated. And then it'll go back into the left atrium, all reoxygenated, but then it needs to get pumped out to the body again. And so the ventricle is going to contract and push blood out to the body. Now, why is it, what are the colors meaning here? Well, the purple's meant to indicate that the blood being pumped from the ventricle to different parts of the body, be it the lungs or the amphibian's systemic coronary system, is going to never be fully oxygenated. So that poor frog is never going to receive in its body fully oxygenated blood, so far less efficient. Remember that the our heart has that septum there that divides a left and a right ventricle, and that allows for complete reoxygenation, which is far more efficient. And then, turtles obviously and other reptiles a little bit more evolved relative to amphibians when we looked at the evolution of organisms. So we can see here in the turtle's heart that it has like a partial septum, and the partial septum does kind of help to separate the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood within that ventricle, but it still is connected, right? So they're getting more oxygenated blood relative to the amphibian, but it's never fully oxygenated. Now, I wanted to also talk to you just about single versus double loops in circulatory systems. So this right here is the circulatory system of a fish. So the fish, you'll remember, it has a two-chambered heart, just one atrium and one ventricle. But the roles are different, right? So, we know that fish have water move across the gills, and that's how oxygen diffuses into their bloodstream. So here's, imagine water with oxygen diffusing across that network of capillaries found in the gills. Reoxygenated blood here, passing through the body's capillaries, and then moving into the heart again, and then atrium and ventricle simply pushing, but the roles are different. The atrium and ventricle are different in the fish than they are in the other systems. Again, so the main point of this was just to show you the single looped circulatory system versus the 1-2 double loop that we find in more evolved species like amphibians and reptiles with their 3-chambered heart, whether there's a partial septum or none, versus the mammal with its 4-chambered heart and that complete septum. So I hope you were able to make sense of the information in this video. Lots there, but feel free again, as always, to send me a quick email with a question, or to join me via our daily Zoom meeting, and we can discuss further.